Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to wait a few more seconds since it's 1 p.m. or also 8 a.m. right on the dot for a few more people to come. Okay, so I think that we can get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This webinar is hosted by Bob, the Complete People Management Platform for Growing Companies. If you have any questions on the platform after the webinar, our Business Development Manager, Adam Phelps, will be on the line. Before I introduce the speaker today and we delve into this discussion, I just wanted to give you a few tips on how you can best participate during the webinar. So this is what your screen should look like. If at any point during the discussion you'd like to raise your hand, there's this little symbol right here that you can click. I'll see that you're raising your hand and then I can unmute you if you have something to say during the discussion. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is this questions box. So if we don't end up getting to you, you can submit your question here and we can go over your question during the Q&A session. So as you probably already read, our speaker today is Paul Green from the Harvard Business School, who's done a tremendous amount of research on feedback in the workplace and will share some of his findings with you today. So let's switch screens and we can get started. There we go.
Thank you, Danielle. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here and talk to you a little bit about some of my research, something that's very interesting to me. Before I jump in, I want to preface the whole thing by saying, if you have questions or comments or don't understand or disagree with something I'm saying, please do raise your hand. Danielle will gladly interrupt me and I'll do my best to answer your question as we go. And then, of course, the latter end of the conversation will be a Q&A and try to answer your questions more directly. So I want to start with a question. I want you to think about yourself personally, sort of introspectively. And my question for you is, do you have a drive to improve, to grow, to develop? My guess is that for most of you, the answer is yes. I doubt that you'd be taking time out of your lunch or breakfast to participate in the webinar if it wasn't a yes. The interesting thing to me, and I had this experience at some point in my work life prior to becoming a researcher, I think the answer for most people is yes, and there's probably some psychology behind that. I think it's a very natural human drive to want to grow, develop, expand, and improve, which suggests that if it is a common human drive, that things like growth and development and improvement in organizational settings should be a pretty easy thing. Organizations are made up of human beings who are presumably motivated to grow, improve, and develop. So growth and development should be pretty simple. And in fact, most organizations have some sort of structural process, and I'm guessing that many of you are involved in some way, shape, or form in facilitating, administering, or designing that process for your organization, but some sort of structural process to help facilitate that, performance management system, feedback processes, so my intuition is that it should be a pretty easy thing. We have these systems and we have people who are primed and ready to go and want to improve, except for it's not the case. In fact, it seems, and this is one of the things that puzzles me, it seems that despite the fact that this seems to be a universal human drive to grow and improve, and organizations desire this growth and development improvement, that organizations by and large, or a great many organizations, are increasingly saying, hey, it's not working for us. Numerous examples in the popular press and magazines and newspapers of companies ditching performance ratings, performance appraisals, eliminating reviews and feedback processes altogether. And it's even present in the academic literature. A recent meta-analysis, the researcher said it's time to treat ratings or peer feedback or employee feedback as a failed experiment. After nearly a century of dashed hopes and unmet expectations, we believe it's time to call a halt to this sorry business. So this intrigued me. It intrigued me that we have human beings who are primed, motivated to grow and develop. They're sitting in organizations that desire that growth and development, and so they build systems and processes to facilitate that. Yet it doesn't seem to work. Now here's a question for each of you. I asked you a moment ago, and I, of course, didn't ask you to verbalize this, but presumably you're all internally driven and motivated to improve and grow. I'm guessing that many of you, if not all of you, are in organizations now or have been in organizations in the past that have some sort of performance management, feedback, structural feedback process. And here's a question for you. What's your experience with those feedback systems? Are they invigorating? Do they serve that internal intrinsic need you have to grow and develop? That's a real question, by the way. I'm curious.
A reminder that you can just click the little hands button if you'd like to be unmuted.
And you don't have to. It's not a requirement that you jump in. Most people's experience is that the process of peer performance feedback, performance evaluation is less than fulfilling experience. And so I want to unpack that a little bit, because I think this tells us a little, this might expose something important about these processes. And I want to start with, I want to start by stepping back and let's think a little bit about the underlying logic or the theory behind these processes. So I'm going to, for the moment, use the idea of a peer rating. Now, many of your organizations may not have a peer rating. That's okay. I think we're going to uncover a principle here that's more universal. But let's think about a peer rating as a way of understanding what peer feedback is supposed to do and how it's supposed to work. Usually there's some sort of process in which I'm employing an organization, do a self-evaluation, a number of attributes that are important to me and to the organization, leadership and team player and creativity. And then, for sake of argument, let's assume that I think I'm a 5. The idea behind feedback, the conceptual or theoretical idea behind feedback, is that it is developmental to the degree that it exposes me to some inadequacy that I'm otherwise blind to. So I think I'm a 5 on the leadership dimension, and my colleague or manager thinks I'm a 4. That's developmental feedback at a conceptual level. The basic idea here is that by receiving this insight that others around me see me as lower than I see myself, it's first meant to inform. That's information I previously didn't have. And then in turn to motivate. I'm motivated to close the gap between how I see myself and how others see me. And maybe you're nodding your head now and saying, okay, I get that. There's some intuition behind that. There is some intuition behind that. And I want to contrast that with feedback that is at or higher than a person's self-evaluation. In this particular case, I think I'm a 3, and my colleague or manager thinks I'm a 4. The idea is that is validating, or let's call it affirming. That's affirming my sense of self, my positive sense of self. It is interesting and exciting and probably makes us feel good, but it's not thought to be particularly developmental because it's not exposing some otherwise unseen inadequacy. So there's this idea that we respond by working to close the gap when we're exposed to these inadequacies. But here's the question: how do we really respond? I was interested in this, and I was interested in it because I, like many of you, had not particularly exciting experiences in organizational settings with feedback, and I realized that so many organizations were struggling with this general question. So I wanted to dig into how we really respond. So I went to a integrated food and agribusiness company in the Western United States and did some research. I'm going to briefly describe my research, and then we'll jump back into what this tells us about organizations more generally and the processes we put in place in organizations. People like this doing this sort of work. This particular organization has a structured peer feedback process, perhaps very similar to the sort of processes that many of your organizations have. There's at the end of the year, there's a self-evaluation on a number of dimensions that the employees within this organization over time have developed and said that these are valuable things. These are things that we all agree will be better as an organization if all of us are better on these dimensions. So there's a self-evaluation process, and each of this person's colleagues, so it's a peer evaluation, similar to a 360 evaluation. Each of this person's colleagues provides a review on the same dimensions. There's a number of ratings, again, on the same dimensions as the self-evaluation, and then the opportunity for the peer to provide written feedback, open-ended written feedback, and then at the very end of the process, each employee receives a sort of a report with their self-evaluation and their colleagues' peer evaluation. It's important to note in this particular company, it's an open process. The feedback isn't tied to any bonus or promotion decision. So a group of employees in the company actually had developed this a number of years ago. And the idea was we want this to be open. It's purely developmental. We all agree we want to grow and develop as employees, and this is the best way to do it. And if it's an open process, we can sit down and have a conversation with the colleagues who provide us the feedback and as a way of figuring out how to improve. So for all intents and purposes, it's an organization where people are driven and motivated to grow and develop, and they built this process that for them seemed to serve that purpose. I went in and looked at the data over 4 years from this peer feedback process, and I paired it up with a separate data set from within the company of colleague relationships. So think about these as being the people who a person or who a person is agreeing to work with over the course of the year. So it's worth noting that this company has a little bit of a free-flowing structure in the sense that employees are in work units, work teams, work groups, and those are employees that they have to remain connected to, where we share this common mission and we're in the same work unit and we work on the same set of equipment together, so we're colleagues. But there are also discretionary relationships in the sense that a person can get involved in some other project with some colleagues from elsewhere within the organization. So think about two types of relationships here being obligatory relationships, these ones that they're part of my team, my group, they remain, and discretionary relationships, new projects I get involved in elsewhere in the organization. And the feedback, it turns out, comes from both of those contingents of colleagues. It comes from those obligatory relationships, and it comes from those discretionary relationships. So I was interested in how are people responding to this relatively negative feedback, the feedback that theoretically should be providing the information and the motivation for an employee to actually work to grow and develop. And I found something surprising. I found that people respond in surprising and unexpected ways, although maybe it's not all that unexpected. In fact, the way people respond is by, well, maybe it's first important to say this. We've talked about this idea of developmental feedback being feedback that is exposing some inadequacy that you didn't see about yourself. Practically speaking, when I think I'm a 5 and my colleague tells me, I think you're a 4, that's new information that is supposed to inspire the development that we've been talking about. But it's also doing something else. It's providing a disaffirming experience. So what I mean by disaffirming, there's this, I opened this by asking how many of you have a natural internal drive to grow and improve and develop. And my instinct is that most of you sort of nodded your head and said, yes, I know I do. But we also have a drive or an internal motive to feel good and positive about ourselves. Now it seems kind of thin and cheap and very surface level, but think about it. How hard is it to function in any environment, in our life, in our work, if we have a chronic negative self-view? So it is fundamental that human beings need to, in order to be well-functioning, need to have a positive self-view. I hope that's not all that surprising, and I hope that at some level you can introspectively see that. But I'm going to pause here and ask, can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's back.
Okay, I apologize about it disappearing.
No worries.
The point here is that the feedback that is developmental is also disaffirming to our positive self-view. It's this experience that threatens our positive view of the self. Experience that threatens the positive view of the self. So for those of you who have had that sort of negative feedback, the developmental feedback, and you said, that's not fun, it's not exciting, I don't like it, I don't like how it makes me feel, it's very normal. It's the experience that most everyone has when they receive that sort of feedback. And perhaps we can say, well, that's why feedback systems don't work, because it's not fun and it doesn't make people who receive the feedback feel good. Except for feedback is not about making people feel good. And furthermore, we all sort of internally at least raised our hand and said, hey, we want to develop and grow. And we know that development and growth requires us seeing something previously unseen about ourselves. So there's this tension here. We want to grow, we want to develop, we need this insight, but it's experienced as disaffirming. And one question is, how do people respond to disaffirmation, this threat to the positive self-view? There's a lot of psychology literature that talks about how people respond to this, and this literature says, well, the mind's a pretty amazing thing. When you exposed Paul to something that's threatening to his positive view of the self, his mind is going to go through all kinds of calisthenics to block that information out, to try to mute the information and say, well, Danielle said that Paul wasn't particularly great on the webinar today, but what does Danielle know about webinars? Or well, they didn't see the best side of me because they didn't have the opportunity to see me on screen. Or we go through all kinds of mental processes in an attempt to mute the threat associated with that. And so that's interesting. And again, hopefully we're not in our head and say, yeah, I've experienced that. I've done that. I know I've done that. But what I find is that we actually do more than that. When we receive this feedback in an organizational setting from colleagues, it's not just that we go through mental sort of gymnastics in order to mute the negative effect and to push it out, but we also, we reshape our social network. We reshape our set of relationships at work in order to try to build a more affirming future environment. So here's what I mean by that. I mentioned that there are two types of relationships, or two types of colleague relationships in this organization I study. And what I find is that employees are first those discretionary relationships, the project-related relationships that people can get involved in. Employees are dramatically more likely to sever a relationship with a discretionary colleague who provides them with disaffirming feedback, that negative but developmentally useful feedback. A colleague who provides them that relatively negative disaffirming feedback, they're much more likely to sever a relationship with that colleague than they are to sever a relationship with a colleague who provides them with affirming feedback that's at or above their self-rating. But what about these employees who I can't sever a relationship with, these obligatory relationships? They're on my work team. I've got to remain working with them. It's not just this sort of discretionary, I can get involved here and if I want to. What we find is that the greater the number of my obligatory relationships, the greater the number of my core work group, the people I have to work with, who provide me with this relatively negative feedback, the more likely I am to try to forge new and relatively distant relationships within the organization. So think about it this way. If a high percentage of my core colleagues, the 8 or 10 people who are part of my team, if a high percentage of them provide me with ratings that are lower than my self-rating, suddenly in my social network, there emerges a new connection. And that new connection is somebody that's relatively distant from my core group of connections. It's somebody who's maybe in a different part of the company or in a completely different unit and not connected at all to my core group of colleagues. And the way to think about this is we're searching for somebody who we prospectively in the future will be more affirming to us and isn't, for lack of a better word, isn't polluted or by the group of colleagues we've got now who see us as less than we see ourselves. And it's important to note that it's not negative feedback, necessarily negative feedback in the eye of the feedback giver. We're filtering the rating here through our self-assessment. And I think the critical feature here is that affirmation is about others seeing us positively, and we filter that through the way we see ourselves. We need others to see us as or better than we see ourselves. And when we're not having that experience, we seek new distant relationships in order to try to increase the probability of the prospect that it'll happen for us in the future. So what does this tell us about structured feedback processes in organizations? On the one hand, it might cause you to feel, well, first of all, Paul, yeah, I think I've had that experience, at least the psychological experience in the past. And second, it might suggest that, well, it's hopeless. In fact, those companies that you put the little images up at the very beginning of this conversation, those companies are doing the right thing. We're eliminating it. I'm not sure that that's the right answer. And I hope that at some level this is the good news. I think what this actually tells us is something a little different about feedback processes. We think about feedback as an interaction across which information is shared. So conveniently for me, I used peer ratings, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 7s. And that's convenient and useful from a research standpoint. But let's broaden the conversation a little bit. Let's talk about feedback more generally. And let's take this conceptual idea, this idea that we need to maintain and sustain a positive view of the self first. And number two, that the people around us can serve as threats to that positive self view. And that threat, that disaffirming information, it doesn't have to come in the form of a number. It can come in the form of a conversation or a written feedback comment. And the irony here is that we build these processes in order to provide these disaffirming interactions. The whole point of the feedback process, or a substantial part of the purpose of a feedback process, is to expose employees to disaffirming information. The goal here is for me to be able to have an interaction that shows me that I think more positively about myself than perhaps the others around me do. So whether it's a rating or a verbal or written interaction, the process is designed to provide disaffirmation. And the thing is, we need that disaffirming feedback in order to grow and develop. And so I want us to take a step back, though, and I want us to think about the feedback interaction not as an interaction. And rather, I want us to think about this. What sort of relationship is strong enough to sustain disaffirming feedback? That is, I want us to think about feedback not as an interaction, but as a instance in a broader relationship. And this is practically true in your organizational setting. It is practically true in the organization I was studying here. That feedback interaction is one interaction over a long extended period of time. That is, it's a moment in the middle of a longer term relationship. My question is, what sort of relationship is strong enough to sustain that disaffirming feedback? That is, what sort of relationship can handle the practical reality of having of being a means by which we gain disaffirming insight about ourselves, yet we're not motivated to sever the relationship. I had this experience recently. I was preparing for a very important academic talk, and I'm married and I have 5 children, and I was preparing for this talk, and so I asked my older children, the 4 oldest, the youngest, I wasn't gonna force them into listening to me give a talk, but I asked my wife and my oldest 4 children if they'd be willing to listen to me give a practice talk in my living room here, and so they agreed, and they're sitting on the couch, and I'm standing in the living room giving a talk. It was funny. The youngest of the 4, he was at the time he's 4 years old. At one point, I paused for dramatic effect, and he, being 4 and being eager to get out of the room, thought Dad's done, and he started clapping and said, "Yay!" and he got up and ran out of the room. So, but once he disappeared, and so it's myself and my wife and my 3 oldest children, and I'm giving this talk, and it's a talk that's very important to me. And I'm giving the talk, and it's going well. I know it's going well. In my mind, it's the best I've ever practiced it. And I just know I'm ready. And I get to the end, and I'm done. And it's one of those moments, if you can envision, sort of, it's almost a mic drop moment. It was just fantastic. And they applaud. And then I'm sitting there waiting to bask in the glow of all of their positive, affirming feedback. And my wife looks at me and said, "Well, I don't think it was that good. It certainly wasn't your best. I think I've seen you do a lot better." And it was disaffirming to the core. Think about what I said about disaffirming. We have this view of ourselves, and we receive this information from somebody else that tells us that the way you're thinking about yourself is not right at all. It's not accurate at all. It crushed me. But there was no part of me that said, well, you know what, maybe I need to sever this relationship and look for a different one. And I think this is the bigger message here, that feedback is a single interaction across a breadth of a number of other interactions. And the reason that thought didn't cross my mind with respect to my wife is that my relationship with my wife is overall a very affirming relationship. That single negative instance is immersed in a broader, more affirming set of interactions. And so the question is, what sort of personal relationships at work can provide that overarching level of affirmation that can enable our employees to encounter these disaffirming interactions? And I think there's some surprising statistics. A recent study showed the percentage of people who have a close friend at work, think about a close friend as being that sort of person who's providing that affirmation, is 30%, and that's all-time low. 30 years ago, it was over half. And if we're thinking about feedback coming from our managers, a recent study suggests that 70% of managers prefer not to interact personally with their subordinates, even at work. They prefer not to have a personal conversation with their subordinates, even at work. Now think about that. The people that we're asking to provide these disaffirming experiences are also people that increasingly not personally connected in some sort of meaningful, affirming way with the people who they're providing that feedback to. And I think that this is where I want to leave it. I want to leave it with this, that I think it's incumbent on us, if we want to activate that natural internal drive that we all and the vast majority of our employees have to grow and improve through some sort of structural process. I think we have to take a more holistic view of the structural process. It's not just about the process. It's not just about the interaction. I think we spend a lot of time as leaders in organizations who are crafting these processes, thinking about what is the appropriate form of the process. What are the right types of words that we need to put in place in order for it to the feedback to be palatable, or what's the right way to do ratings in order for them to not be, to yield the development we want. And I think those are good questions and useful questions. And I think it's a testament to all of you that you're here, that you probably think about a lot of those things, and you made some great progress on that front. But I think it's also incumbent on us to step back and think about, how do we structurally within our organization foster these closer, more personal connections between colleagues or between managers and subordinates in order to prepare the ground so that these disaffirming experiences can be received and acted upon. And then personally, as a person within an organization who's going to be providing feedback or presumably receiving it, there's a power in cultivating these affirming relationships. They can withstand these incidents of disaffirmation. So I think it's incumbent on us personally as colleagues, if we're going to be in a position of providing this relatively negative feedback to colleagues and peers or subordinates, to invest in advance in an overarching affirming relationship. With that, I'm going to pause and I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle, and we'll see if there are any questions or any thoughts that this has inspired for all of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, during the conversation, Caroline made the comment that when it's someone that you like and respect, that you would be better able to listen to their feedback.
That's exactly right. And I think that that's a reflection of this broader point here, that feedback that does come from that person who you like or respect. And I think that those are two different things. So respect is you know, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, and there are people who I'm very close to in my research circle. Some of those people are far senior to me, like my advisors, and some of those people are more junior than me. And I have one particular very, very close friend who's quite a bit more junior to me. I respect him as a person, but more importantly, I really, really like him. We've developed a very close relationship. I can receive feedback from him, even if the feedback is not particularly great, or ultimately it turns out that it's wrong or naive. I can receive feedback from him, but I think that's a little different from receiving feedback from a very senior person in my discipline who I don't know very well. So I guess my point is, I think there are a couple of ways that we can increase the usefulness or developmental nature of the feedback, or decrease the disaffirmation. One is if it comes from a very, very well-respected person. The interpersonal relationship, though, goes beyond professional respect, and it doesn't necessarily rely on me trusting in their knowledge or expertise. But yeah, I think that's a fantastic insight and perfectly aligned with the overall point here.
And a question from Alistair is, successive feedback is also about permission as well, though, that people, unless they asked for or are being asked if they want it, they don't receive it very well. He also made the comment that that's why most corporate systems don't work very well, because they're imposed almost violently upon the recipient rather than being invited.
So this is Alistair, you said?
Yes.
So I'd be curious to see what Alistair thinks. That intuitively, I agree with that point. I think that when you ask somebody for feedback, and you do this all the time in the academic world, and I think many people do this all the time in the professional world, when you ask somebody for feedback, you've already put yourself in a position where you're expecting some sort of disaffirmation. You're looking for the developmental insight. And I think Alistair's point is well taken in the sense that what was the term he used? The violently imposed. I think that's beautiful. I think it's exactly right, that we do violently impose feedback on people who didn't ask for it. But the problem is that ultimately we're trying to create an organization environment where people are improving, and practically speaking, people aren't necessarily walking around asking for that sort of feedback. So I think one of the puzzles for me is, how do we create, in the event that people aren't going around asking the right people for the right types of feedback, either because they don't want it, although I don't think that that's the reason they're not asking. I think quite often it's because they don't know they need to ask. I don't want to get too philosophical or too abstract here, but I think practically speaking, one of the problems that organizational systems is intended or designed to serve is, even when well-intentioned, well-meaning people who would ask if they knew they needed to, don't. We need to figure out a way to provide that feedback.
Alistair, I'll unmute you just so that you can comment back. Give me 1 second. Okay, you should be able to speak.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Hi, Alistair. How are you?
Very good, Paul. Good. Yes, it's interesting. permission thing, and also about you're right. So how to get people to be good at asking for feedback, and I think that maybe is the organizational focus. Is just that asking for and giving feedback just becomes the norm, but it kind of starts that way around rather than giving feedback being the first port of call. So I think a lot of people don't ask for feedback because they're worried about what might be said, and two, they're kind of quite happy in their little kind of bubble and all that sort of stuff. But I think as soon as you reframe feedback as you say, as you started with, it's a process for improvement.
Yeah.
And reframe it like that. And as you say, everyone wants to improve, right? So and then suddenly it changes the whole discussion. Then I think people are far more willing once they kind of understand the why to then maybe ask, and then and then you can bring in very light ways of doing feedback. Like I love doing like thumb ratings and kind of stuff like that. Like after a meeting, was that a thumbs up or in the middle or a thumbs down? And then you can get as people get used to it, then you can get deeper and more challenging and there's another question which I had at the start of it, which is about it's how that feedback is then given. So if it's done with judgment, then it's not likely to be received very, very well. But if it's done in the spirit of challenge, but also support, then it's far more likely to be received well.
So what is? I just have a curious. How do you think about judgment? Can you give me an example of feedback with judgment?
Yeah, very simple. Like, you are bad at this. If you go bad, that is a judgment. That's a judgment call, and the person giving the feedback may or may not be right. But it's very unlikely that the person receiving that was probably going to respond well to it, as you say, because there's probably a big disconnect between their own view of how they did. No one likes to think they do stuff badly. So if someone just says they're bad, then you can, there's a massive disconnect between their self image and the image of the other person. So if you can reframe the language and talk about, here are some things you could do better. It's just as simple as that. Just kind of turn it around. Then I think there's still some implied judgment in there, but it's a little less kind of aggressive.
So here's I buy that, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I don't want to strain the comparison here, but I hope you'll indulge me here. I mentioned that I'm married, and I got some feedback from my wife on a talk, which crushed me.
Which you didn't ask for.
Which I didn't ask for. I mean, I thought I was in great shape. It was crushing. And to be quite honest with you, it was somewhat judgmental. That was not a particularly good talk.
Absolutely.
And so here's the thing. We do all kinds of. This is one of the things that strikes me as intriguing, and it got me interested in this broader line of research. And I don't pretend to have all the answers at all, but we invest all kinds of time and energy into feedback training in organizational settings. Yeah. Yet nobody does wife/husband/partner feedback training, and yet relationships seem to survive. We seem to, again, at least some proportion. I guess I don't study marriage, but I guess the statistics are perhaps somewhat alarming. The point here, though, is that maybe the point is that we should be invested in that. But I think part of the point here is that that we become more interpersonally resilient. We can handle the judgment in a different relational context, and I think that I think my research, I hope my research and this line of thinking, if it does anything, that it inspires us to think a little more broadly, that it's not just about the interaction. It's not just about, can we do it in a way that's not threatening? Can we do it in a way that's non-judgmental? And I agree that to the degree we can do that, we're much better for it. But recognizing that if the strands of the connection between the people are strong enough, that we have to tiptoe a little bit less around each other, that we don't have to worry about walking on eggshells in the way we do it. So I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I think my overarching point here is I think we need to think about the broader set of connections between people and how that reduces the need for us to focus so intently on the nature of the feedback itself. Thanks so much, though, for the comments and thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
back to
So
you,
remember,
Daniel.
yes, you can either submit your questions in the question box, or you can go ahead and raise your hand for any questions that you might have for Paul, and I can unmute you. So here's one coming in um, from Caroline. Caroline, would you like me to unmute you, or I can read off your question? So Caroline has a small business, a team of 3, and she's the boss. She holds meetings every Monday morning where she has to give feedback on sales. That they all work together, but even when she's positive and says that there's need for improvement, it still affects the morale and mood at the office.
Yeah, totally. So Caroline, I think there's a possibility that there are a few different things going on. So the first thing is that I'm not necessarily suggesting that this isn't going to affect people psychologically. I think what my broader set of theoretical hypotheses are that even if it hits me psychologically, it doesn't make me immune to the feeling. But if I've got that sort of deep relationship with the person providing the feedback, even though it does hurt, and I may in the moment get upset, I was particularly hurt and stung and stunned when my wife provided me with that disaffirming feedback. But so even when I have that experience in the moment, ultimately, I'm less likely to turn to some sort of psychologically palliative endeavor, like searching for new relationships. And I know it's a strain again, but stick with me. And more likely to ultimately, at some point, once the initial sting wears off, to engage with the feedback, maybe engage with the person trying to figure out what it is they're talking about, ultimately to engage with the feedback and think about, okay, what do I need to do to improve this? And I think that's partially because that person, the connection with that person matters to me. And it's partially because I know that the relationship is providing me overall with the stuff that I'm hoping for and expecting for out of that relationship. So I don't think that we're ever going to be able to, at least my instinct is, I don't know that we're going to be able to eliminate the feeling of receiving negative feedback. I know that there's been the last couple of years, been some press about a few companies that are doing it. I think the company that does radical feedback, and listening to those folks or talking to them, that they seem to truly enjoy it. But I don't think the vast majority of people enjoy it. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to change that part. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I don't know if this is the case within your organization, but in organizational settings, it is very hard for employees to disentangle developmental feedback from risk to my livelihood or risk to my position within the organization, or challenging to my future income or to my career prospects. And I think that's a separate question, but I do think that manifests itself quite often in organizational settings. And this isn't at least tangentially related to the point Alistair was making. There's a feeling that people get in organizational settings as soon as we put a structure in place or a system in place. There's a feeling that this is somehow connected to other things that matter to me, like income, career prospect, and promotion. So I think it's really, really important for us to the degree possible, separate those two things, figure out a way to put walls between them. And I recognize, Caroline, that at some level this is almost impossible in a smaller organization, in part because you're probably a key person making promotion and compensation decisions, and you're also the person providing this feedback. But if there's a way that you can, I think, disconnect those two in some structural way, I think that helps a little bit. But my sense is that I'm not really answering your questions other than to say that I understand the point you're making.
And to kind of build off of that, and it's a question that I had, and also Alistair just brought up as well, is then how do we go about building these strong relationships? And to add to that is, how do you really know where to draw the line between personal and work relationships? Because there are situations where you hear about a manager texting and going out with his employees, and it sounds inappropriate. So how do you develop a strong enough personal relationship so that it still remains professional?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I think that's the heart of where a lot of my research is currently going. So here's one thing to think about. I'm definitely not advocating for personal romantic relationships in the workplace, or things of that nature. I think ultimately what we should be thinking about is the employee's experience of the relationship. And I think the things that I'm getting that really make for these sort of close relationships are the feeling that this person cares about me as a person, cares about my happiness and my success, and that's illustrated to me over the course of my interactions with that person. And that this relationship, this person, in this person's mind, they have an intention of investing in me and ensuring that I am successful, not in an instrumental way for them within the organization, but because I'm important to them as a person. And I think that's part of the tension here, that these close personal relationships that I'm talking about are the sorts of things that are valued in and of themselves. Think about your close friendships, close friendships out of work. We don't forge those relationships around some sort of instrumental thing. That is, maybe it's best to contrast this with a traditional work environment. We have this view in work settings that we are only valued as long as we are delivering some value to the others within the organization. So my boss only cares about me to the degree that I deliver on what I'm delivering on day in and day out. So I think the broader question is, how do you cultivate in your interactions with others this sense that this person cares about me as a person? Not necessarily romantically, but just that as a human being, that I matter as a human being. I actually think that that's a hard thing to do in organizational settings, quite honestly. And partially because we tend to think about organizations as being this instrumental exchange as opposed to, a set of connections. At the same time, I think we're all naturally attuned to or inclined to the forging or cultivating those sort of relationships. So I think it comes natural to us if we actually care about the other person at a personal level. But is the question about how do we interpersonally forge those relationships, or how do we, as at an organizational level, create structurally enable those?
Caroline's also asking, can you still be friendly to your employees and still gain the respect that you need from them?
So I think so, but I'd be curious to see. I'd be curious to see what others in the room think. My instinct is absolutely yes. In fact, but I'm not sure that that's universally shared. But do others have a differing perspective on that?
Caroline, I'll go ahead and unmute you. See if that works.
Hi, Caroline. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm a small business owner. We're a model and event staffing agency. So I have young girls working for me. They're in like their early 20s, late teens. I'm on my fifth girl at the moment. I feel I've just made an error in judgment of how I've been as an employer, as a boss with them. I'm a naturally friendly person, but I feel it has advantage of. I've just taken on a new staffer, and I'm just being, obviously I'm joining this webinar today. I've got big passion for my business, and I feel I treat the girls with respect, and I give feedback on a Monday morning, as I said. But because I'm in a small team in a small office, I just don't know how friendly I can be towards these girls. I don't discuss my personal life. I am drawing the line. Yeah, I guess I don't know how other people here on this line probably got a lot more experience than me of being a boss. But I was just interested in your perspective, of your advice of how I can gain respect, still be a friendly boss towards them, but
Yes.
have
So,
listen to feedback. And
yeah, so part of the answer to that, and I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with your specific set of circumstances and people working within the organization, but I think part of the answer to that is I'm not sure. I don't think that being friendly or caring about the person as a person requires you to relax your expectations of performance, or for you to be forgiving or accepting of inadequacy or anything like that. And so I think the short answer is I think setting some understandings at the very beginning of a relationship is really, really important. And you have to figure out how to navigate that best. But I hesitate to use sports analogies because they don't always translate to international audiences. But I enjoy basketball, and there's a team that I'm just fascinated with here in the United States. It's one of the for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been one of the highest performing basketball teams in the National Basketball League. And the coach has this radically different view, very high expectations for performance, very open about it, is very open about giving feedback. There are these legendary videos of him throwing and breaking the clipboards on the sideline when he's angry with the team for not delivering. So very clear expectations for what we're striving to do, how we're striving to do it, what it is we're here to achieve. We're here to win championships. We're here to win every single game, and very open about feedback. But he's also very open about the fact that these players matter to me as people. So he's very sensitive to, and he's open about this. And originally, when he first got into coaching, he got a lot of heat for this. That he sensitive to people's personal life, what was going on in the personal life, would give the team, days off, even though they're in the middle of the season and it should be, it's a structure and discipline. But it seems like the team is, not had enough time with their family, and we should take a few days and just everyone go spend time with their family. We'll skip practice for the next day and a half, and being very attentive to them at a personal level outside the organizational setting. And in his mind, it contributes to the dynamic of the team. The team has cultivated this dynamic where they care about each other as people, as individuals.
That'd be my ideal. That'd be my perfect work situation. But I just feel that it almost gets taken advantage of.
Yeah, I think there's a risk of that. And so that's why I say I think it's critically important that you figure out a way to set the expectations at the very beginning. Here's how we're going to be. I care about you personally, but it's contingent on us having a shared understanding about what it is we're here to achieve, how we're going to achieve it, the amount of openness that we're going to have around our failure to achieve it when we do it. And that goes both directions. That may not work with everyone. Your particular contingent of employees, it may or may not work with them, but I do think that setting those personal leadership principles up front, this is how I'm going to approach this. This is the discipline that I want to build with my team, and here are the expectations I want to set. I think it is very possible to find a group of people that number one, are attracted to that. Number two, want to build a career in that sort of environment. Number three, are willing to and able to excel in that sort of environment.
I'm literally starting from scratch again. So I've got all new employees. So I'm just looking at taking advice from other people. I'm reading lots of blogs about leadership. And yeah, so it's good to hear. It's good to hear this today as well.
Excellent. Danielle, back to you.
Yeah, and just one more question before we wrap up. Again, from Alistair, he wonders how employees would design a feedback process if they were given the chance.
Yeah, so I don't know how most employees would design it. It's worth noting that the feedback process I designed that I described in this organization was actually designed by a group of employees. It was a task force of people that wasn't driven by company leadership at all. It was a group of people, 6 or 8 people got together and started thinking about what they felt like they needed personally, went around and surveyed a bunch of employees within the company. I think, of course, this wasn't a 10,000 person company, it was a couple of thousand people, but surveyed a bunch of people within the company and talked about what it is they thought they needed. And so this process was actually developed by employees. It's ironic because in that same context, we see this really surprising set of behaviors resulting from the feedback, which makes me wonder how much more extreme it might be in an organization where people didn't design it. Nevertheless, I think, ironically, this process conforms pretty closely to most organizations' structural process, with the exception of it being open. That is, I know who provided them with the feedback. But I think that's a fascinating question, Alistair, and I think it would be really exciting to do research with companies who are tolerant of allowing their employees to craft a process that works for them, and just to see how it goes and how people's sentiments are different going through the process by virtue of the fact that they created it, they designed it.
And then just one more question from Sophia. She says that our company promotes the EAR, event action result, toward employees for feedback discussion. Are there any other feedback models that you would recommend?
So I'm not sure about feedback models. There are some principles around feedback that I think a number of them have been tested, and this is along the lines of a couple of points that Alistair was making earlier. I think there is, for what it's worth, there's a discipline to giving good developmental feedback that is likely to be listened to, less likely to be perceived as threatening or challenging. There's a discipline to that. I think that the model that you're thinking of, Sophia, is probably designed around some of these basic principles. Alistair brought up another, so the basic idea of, we're sort of dropping a bomb in people's lap with this feedback that's unrequested and not necessarily even expected. But more generally, a few principles, and there's a lot of writing about this. If you want to reach out, I can point you to some things, but a few basic principles. Try to get at the behavior as opposed to the person. This is something that Alistair was alluding to. Try to figure out what is the behavior, what is the negative outcome of the behavior, making it future-based in terms of providing cues for how behavioral change can lead to better outcomes, but also looking and providing or crafting the feedback, looking at what specific outcomes and behaviors in the past have contributed to that. And I think the EAR process is conceptually aligned around a number of those things. I think the final thing is it's very quickly worth noting that a number of years ago, there's a very large meta-analysis of a bunch of academic papers looking at feedback. And what they found is that task-based feedback is far more effective than person-based feedback. And that may not be all that enlightening or mind-blowing, but the point is that feedback that is around a specific task and uses objective measurement is far more likely to yield performance improvements than feedback that is subjective in nature and about a person. The problem is that we don't need help coming up with task-based feedback by and large. If we can come up with a measurement for it, I think we all intuitively leverage that measurement. I think the difficult dimension is when we say things like leadership development, like when we want a person to improve on leadership, I'm just going to say this and then I'll stop because I know we're running short on time, but when we say things like, Paul, I think you can improve as a leader, that sentiment that you have is the product of a number of small interactions, which honestly are very difficult for you to sort of store and make sense of in an action behavior way. So I think this is a function. Part of the reason it's hard to give feedback is that we as individuals sort of accumulate a sentiment about a person's leadership based on a number of small experiences. But when it comes time to get feedback, we're not supposed to provide the feedback about our sentiment. It's supposed to be about the behavior. And that's not how we store in the file cabinet of the mind, so to speak. It's not really how we tend to store our sentiments about a person. So I think one of the most challenging things for a person to do is to accumulate all of these sentiments and then turn that back around into behavior-based feedback, which argues for more frequent, smaller scale, interactional type feedback of the sort that Alistair, for example, was talking about. It's a meeting. We're not going to wait to the end of the year to talk about meeting management. What we're going to do is at the end of every meeting sort of have a very quick, how did this one go and why? And I'll stop there, Danielle.
Yeah, so right on time. Just so that you all have this information, if you have any questions on Bob, you can email Adam. If you have any questions about this webinar or future events, you can email me. We'll be sending a recording of this webinar to you after. I know a few people have already asked about that. And thank you so much, Paul, for sharing these insights.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. It was a joy.